Good morning, can you hear me? Good morning, can you hear me? Good morning, can you hear me? Welcome. I am hoping today will be a good day for us all, and we will all learn and grow. And we are on our way to passing our BGCSE biology. So here we are. I hope that video was a useful introduction to you. And we will move on now to our PowerPoint presentation. Give me a minute, I will get there. Were you able to hear the video? Okay, I'll have to play it again then. I'm sorry about that. Let me set it up again. We are here. Okay, we're going to do it one more time. Share screen. Here we go. And share computer sound. And off we go.
Which are located in special buds at the tips of the shoots or in the leaf axils. Flower structure in angiosperms shows enormous diversity. Some flowers are large, colourful and sweet-smelling. Some are large, colourful and smell of carrion, such as Stopelia. Others are tiny, inconspicuous and have no smell. The petals of the corolla may be fused or separate, while some flowers have no petals at all. This outstanding diversity is associated with the method of pollination. Plants are most often pollinated by wind or insects. Insect-pollinated plants usually have colourful and structurally complex flowers that produce small quantities of pollen. On the other hand, wind-pollinated plants have flowers of a simple structure that produce considerable quantities of pollen. The perianth of insect-pollinated plants provides protection for the stamens and pistils. At the same time, their odour and colour attract insects. In wind-pollinated plants, the perianth is made up of two scales, the palea and the lemma, that surround the pistil and stamens. Another difference between the flowers of insect and wind-pollinated plants is the presence of a pedicel. Pedicels are only found in insect-pollinated plants. The flower parts that play a direct role in sexual reproduction in both insect and wind-pollinated plants include the stamens, which are the male organs that produce microspores, and the pistil, which is the female organ that produces megaspores. In wind-pollinated plants, the stigma of the pistil is large and projects out of the flower, whereas in insect-pollinated plants, the stigma is small and enclosed within the flower.
Good. I hope that was helpful to you all, and I'm hoping very much that you heard me. Okay, everyone here, we should be able to, we're looking at the PowerPoint that is a part of the lesson. I'm going to start a little further back from yesterday's lesson, well, the last lesson. And with the structure of the flower, we have the stamen, the anther, we have the stamen, the anther, that produces pollen grains, a filament, which supports the anther, and then the female part, the carpels, which have a flat stigma at the top, which receives pollen grains. It's usually sticky as well. The style, which is a long tube that supports the stigma and connects the stigma to the ovary. the ovaries, inside the ovaries, we have your ovules. So in pollination, the pollen grain carries male gametes and the ovule, which carries a female gametes. And you have the pollination, which is a transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. And here you can see you have the anther splitting, freeing the pollen grains, which land on the stigma. A pollen tube is produced and grows down the style into the ovary. Here is a dissected anther with a pollen sac of pollen grains in it. And here's an ovule and a microflower. That is the hole through which the pollen tube will come into. If you look at a seed, there's a scar on the side of a seed, and at the top of the scar, there's a little hole, and that is where the micropyle was. So here we go, today's part of our journey. Insect pollinated flowers. Generally, they are larger and conspicuous. Conspicuous means nice, bright, and showy. You know, when you put on your best clothes and you just have all your bling on, they are conspicuous. Brightly colored, often with an insect guide. That is, they have one petal that may be different from the others and have things that you can think of as runway marks running along it. They have nectaries at the base of the flower, which produce nectar. We've been hearing about nectar since Bible class and John the Baptist eating his nectar and honey. So yeah, I'm making that up. Insects, and they're also strongly scented. The reason why they need to be strongly scented is to attract the insects, and not just insects, but also birds, to come and collect this nectar. It's sweet, it's full of sugar, and they want food. In an insect pollinator, the answers are found inside the flower. What they mean by inside the flower is means protected within the petals. And the stigma is found also inside the flower. And you want it inside the flower because when the insects...
Hi, I'm Earth Ranger Giovanna, and I'm here at the fantastic hothouse to talk to you about bumblebees. Now you're probably wondering, what do bees and tomatoes have in common? Well, bumblebees actually play a very important role in the production of tomatoes. Here to tell me more is Dr. Purdy, who's been studying bees for over a decade.
Thanks, Giovanna. You're right. Bumblebees do have a very special role when it comes to producing tomatoes. Their role is to pollinate the flowers on the tomato plants. See, pollination happens when a brightly colored powder is moved from one part of the flower to another. The pollen is produced in the male part of the flower, which is called the anther, and it's moved to the female part.
I'm sorry, are you hearing something in the background? I am, and I'm trying to get rid of it. Okay, so here we go. I'm sorry about that. I'm fixing my arrows as I go along. And here it is about insect pollinators again. They have a small number of pollen grains which are rougher and heavier with spikes. And in colder climates, flowers appear in a warmer season. In a wind-pollinated flower, they're generally very small and inconspicuous, hardly noticed. You can't hardly see them if they're there at all. They're green or dull colored or having no petals at all. There are no nectaries, no need to have nectaries because they could care less whether an insect comes by them or not. and they have no scent. Again, for the same reason, they're not trying to attract insects. The wind is going to do the job for them. And their anthers hang outside the flower. Now I want you to think about why you think these anthers hang outside. They hang outside because you want the pollen to be able to be shaken off of the anther when the wind blows. If it's all inside the petals, then it'll be more difficult for the pollen grains to scatter. The stigma is large and feathery and also hanging outside the flower or exposed to catch the pollen grains. They have a large number of pollen grains, which are lighter with a smooth surface. They have to be lighter because here again, we want to catch in the wind. They have a smoother surface because the stigmas of the other plants, the stigma of the wind pollinated flowers are feathery and they will catch them. You may want to have to prevent self-pollination so you can have yourself some genetic variation. And ways of preventing self-pollination is to have different levels of stigma and anther, male and female parts maturing at different times on the same plant, a unisexual flower. In other words, the flower only has male parts or the flower only has female parts. Or you can have pollen tubes that cannot germinate into the same plant. So some of you are getting your questions answered. And I'm sorry about having that other video playing in the background. I could have sworn I turned it off, and then nope, I did not. Glad I got it off for you. I have one more PowerPoint to show you. You'll see some of the information repeated, but I think that it's worth repeating. Insect and wind pollination questions come up a lot on the paper 3 of the biology, and they want details and they like details. So let's get you some more wind and insect pollinated flowers. Here we go. So insect and wind pollination again. So pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther of one flower to the stigma of the flower of the same species. You have insect pollination here, and you have wind pollinated, where insects carry the pollen, wind pollinated when wind carries the pollen. Here's a beautiful picture of a bee feeding on his nectar, and as he feeds, the pollen that's on the stigmas are going to get all over his body, so that when he goes to another flower, it can brush on to the stigma of another flower of the same species. In a wind pollinated flower, you see if most of us looking at this who are not biology students would look at this and say, that's not a flower, that's just leaves. But they're not. They are small, inconspicuous flowers, and you can see the stamen with the anther and the filaments, and then you have your feathery stigma. So this is what wind pollinated flowers with grass looks like. So grass, maize, which is corn, you have to know both names. What we call corn on the cob, that's maize. They have this type of flower here, where you have your green bracts, these green things here that you see on the side of in the picture. They're called bracts or palea. And then you have your pendulous stamens. When you see the word pendulous, it means like a pendulum, like something that swings. If you look inside, you see inside a school bell, you have that nice pendulum shaking side by side, side to side. Well, these stamens are like a pendulum that hang outside the flower. And when the wind blows, they shake. And so you have these pendulous stamen and your feathery stigma. In detail, each of the features. So in insect pollinated plants, we have large colored petals to attract the insects. This is a flower of a poor man's orchid. You see these 4 petals are basically alike, and you have this sort of guiding petal. All of these things here, sort of these larger veins in here, they can act like a guide. But you have the special petal that has these deeper veins that act as a guide, like a runway for the insect to make its way down and land. And you can see here your stigma curled over, and as the insect comes in, the top of the stigma will brush on it. Any pollen that it has on it will come onto the stigma, and as it goes further in, the anthers, it will brush against the anthers, and the pollen will fall onto the insect. In wind pollinated, this is guinea grass. You find it all around the bush in here. Long ago in the dark ages, when I took my leaving exams, we had to learn how to draw this plant and its full life cycle. Aren't you glad you don't have to do that? So the flowers, again, are small or absent, and they're protected by small brown or green bracts. Flowers usually have a scent to attract insects, and we have bees, we have butterflies, and also ants. Yeah, ants. Birds, such as hummingbirds, also pollinate. So even though we are saying insect pollinated, maybe we should actually say animal pollinated, but same thing, the same features apply, birds and insects. The flowers of wind pollinated flowers are not scented. So as you say, the insect pollen produce nectar, and when the insects feed, they transfer the pollen. Some petals have these guidelines we're talking about. And again, with wind pollinated, there's no nectar. In an insect pollinated flower, the flower faces upward. Like when you see the rose, oh, look at the beautiful rose, showing all its petals up. But in a wind pollinated flower, it hangs down. So like a bell, so it can shake their thing. Insect pollinated stamens are inside a ring of petals. And so it makes it more likely for the insects to pick up the pollen. In wind pollinated, the stamens hang outside. So the filaments are long and loose, and when you shake them, the pollen so it dangles loosely, exposing the pollen. When the wind blows, the pollen can go through. In the wind pollinated flower, the stigma is feathery. And because of this, having all these lots of filaments, like a brush, a fuzzy paintbrush, I guess, it has lots of places for the pollen to land on. even the pollen of insect and wind pollinated flowers are different. In insect pollinated flowers, you have large sticky pollen grains. This is a picture of them under a microscope. In wind pollinated, the pollen is drier and lighter. I will have to reinsert the picture of the wind pollinated pollen when I upload this for you. And again, insect pollinated stigma is sticky inside the flower. Insects more likely to brush against it. In wind pollinated, feathery stigma hangs outside the flower to catch the pollen grains floating in the air. Now let's talk about self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is just like it says. The flower is going to pollinate itself. Now there's two types of self-pollination. You can have it within the same flower, where the pollen comes from the anther of a flower and lands on the stigma of that same flower. Or it can be on two flowers of the same plant, where the pollen from the anther from one flower is transferred to the stigma of another flower in the same plant. Now, if you have pollen, they're going to be in the same genetic family. They're going to have the same genes. And so the offspring will be really close to the parents. And that might cause a problem in the long run. But we'll get to that. So let's have a look at this again. You have self-pollination, where you can go from anther of one flower, where the pollen can go from the anther of one flower to land on the stigma of the same flower. Or it can go from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower on the same plant. Now, self-pollination can be prevented. And it needs to be prevented because you want variety. Variation, genetic variation, is better for the survival of a species. If conditions change, then you'll have some offspring that are slightly different from the parents, and they may have a better chance of survival. So in self-pollination is prevented by the stamens, the male parts, and the carpels becoming mature at different times. One will mature before the other. Another way to do it is to have separate male and female flowers. Some plant species have separate male and female trees. And here we have cross-pollination. Cross-pollination occurs when the pollen from the anther of one flower lands in the stigma of another flower of a different plant of the same species. It has to be of the same species. Pollen from one species is not going to pollinate the flower of another species. So a hibiscus flower will not pollinate a poor man's orchid flower. When you have cross-pollination, you get yourself some genetic variation. The male gametes, or the male sex cells, are in pollen grains, and they have different genes than the ovules of the flower that they will fertilize. The new plant will therefore have differences from either of the parent plants. And this here is our cross-pollination. This nice little busy bee will take the pollen from here, from these anthers, to the stigma, where you have cross-pollination. Self-pollination, if you go from here to here, so the offspring introduce a variety of plants to the population. if conditions change. Some will be better adapted than their parents and are more likely to survive. Variation may also allow the species to be spread to new areas where there may be differences in environmental conditions. When we talk about seed dispersal, then we will see how important it is that you can be spread out. So I see a question here that says, you have to differentiate between wind and insect pollinated animals. Yes, I think you will have to. Yes. What answer did you not hear? Oops, sorry. I'm mute. I'm unmute. Okay, so I hope you could hear me during that whole long presentation. And I'm sorry I went so fast in the PowerPoint, but I will upload it and you'll be able to go through it on your own. Oh, I wasn't mute, thank goodness. So yes, you will have to differentiate between wind and insect pollinated in your exam. And you'll also be able to you'll also have to be able to label both types of flower. If you go into the resources for, I think it was week 1, you will see that there is a plant review sheet for you to work on, and it will let you answer questions on it. And hopefully when you get back to school, you'd have printed it out nicely, and your teacher could have go to do your corrections with you. Any more questions? It hasn't been decided how the worksheets are going. It hasn't been fully decided how the worksheets are going to be assessed. That would, I guess, be between you and your teachers. But you and your friends can work together and see if you can help yourselves get answers. But try it for yourself first. What I really recommend before you even try them is that you take your notes from your textbook, from the PowerPoint, from other sources, and you can basically study it, and then try to answer the questions without looking at the notes, and then checking with the notes to see how your answers go. The question on orange plants, pollinated citrus plants. You can get variations of within citrus groups, but people who produce, you'll have to ask your agriculture teacher, because some of this is above my pay grade, but I could look it up for you. But also people who do things commercially. Sorry, the people who do things commercially, they try to make sure that the plants they have the features they do. So they use some type of artificial propagation. They use vegetative reproduction to get their plants. So this went much quicker than I thought it would. I agree with the nice person who said that I went the PowerPoint too fast. I'm going to slow down. And since we have 20 minutes left, I will start the second section. Okay, are we ready for fertilization, which follows pollination? We're not going to get to fruits. That's a whole nother thing. Here we go, fertilization. Fertilization is the fusion of the male gamete and female gamete to form a zygote. Fusion, not fusion cinema people, let's not go there, please, thank you. Fusion is a joining, okay? So you have the fusion of the male gamete and the female gamete. A gamete is a sex cell. All organisms that reproduce sexually, including us, have male gametes and female gametes. The male gamete for the flowering plant is contained within the pollen grain, and the female gamete in flowering plants is found within the ovary as the ovule or ovules. And when you have, with the pollination, where it showed the pollen grain traveling down your tube with the and the nucleus, the male nucleus from the pollen grain going down the style into the ovary and into the ovule to fuse with the nucleus of the ovule to form a zygote. A zygote is a single cell, and the male gamete has the half the number of chromosomes, and the female gamete has the other half. And together they form a new cell, the zygote, which has both those gametes from both the male and female. So what happens is the pollen grains land on a stigma, and then they secrete a sugary solution. This stimulates the development of a pollen tube, which grows down the style and ovary. The tube secretes an enzyme to digest a path through the style. Secrete simply means gives off. And you've heard of enzymes before. They are chemicals produced by living things that help break down other things. So this enzyme is breaking down the tissues of the style so to clear a path down to the ovary. The male gamete is liberated in the ovary and fuses with the egg cell. Remember, the fusion is a joining. And anybody who ever sat on a sticky hot seat will feel that you've, you know, when you sit on gum, you feel like you fuse to it. Yeah, but this here is a more chemical, biological fusion. So here we have fertilization again. We have the pollen grains released. They land at the top of the stigma. A pollen tube starts to grow, and the sperm cells, which are the nuclei of the pollen of the male gamete, they're going to go towards the ovule, which has 2 nuclei in it. Thankfully for us, we do not have to go into this great detail as to what happens at each stage with megaspores, but we do need to know this part of it here, where you have the fusion of your nuclei and the formation of your zygote. So what happens to these flower parts after fertilization? This is a question that has been asked in the past, and probably will be asked again. So the sepals, the petals, and the stamens wither and fall off. Remember now, the sepals and the petals were there to protect the flower while it's a bud, and the sepals protect the flower while it's a bud. The petals protect the other parts while it's waiting to do their thing. You don't need the stamens anymore, so they fall off. The ovary, a fertilized ovary, becomes a fruit. Fertilized ovary will become a fruit. The ovary wall becomes a fruit wall. The ovule becomes a seed. So fertilized ovule is your seed. The integument becomes your seed coat. The fertilized egg, or fertilized ovule, becomes the embryo, surrounded by an endosperm, which supplies food to it. The embryo of a plant has a embryonic root and an embryonic shoot. Okay, so there we go. I am hoping that that has helped you a lot. Please feel free to go back to week 1 where these resources are posted, and you can go over them slowly at your own pace. Those of you who have a textbook, please feel free to use your textbook, and also your you should search YouTube and get other videos that you may find useful for you. Not just YouTube, but PowerPoints as well. Some of the keywords you can put in your search is GCSE, IGCSE, and of course biology, because then you'd narrow down. You don't want college level videos or videos that do not align with a high school level syllabus. I want to thank you for joining me. I am finishing much earlier than I thought I would, so y'all can go and eat some more of your parents' food. Any more questions? I'll hang around for a couple more minutes. If you wish to leave, you can leave, but if you want to answer questions, I'll answer them. Yes, you're having questions to answer. Like I said, if you check the resources, there is a there's a worksheet. Let me see if I can find it among my many things I have open. Here we go. This is the worksheet that's on the website, Reproduction in Flying Pants. It starts with some multiple choice questions. These questions were all taken directly from years and years of BGCSE exams. Here's the Our Lovely Wind and Insect Pollinated question. How many of you think you can answer that one? I'm not answering it for you. And we haven't gotten around to seed dispersal yet, but I'll try that for our next lesson. Different types of seeds, germination, all of these things are coming up. So if you print this out, if you can, or you can write out the answers if you can't print them out, you can find all of these answers, these questions. And here is a half flower of a poor man's orchid, and you can label all of the parts. And then it asks you what the parts are for, what is fertilization, what is pollination, explains the difference between self-pollination and cross-pollination. Is a flower wind pollinated? And then you have a wind pollinated flower picture. And then we have pollination and fertilization. You have to be able to label this carpel with the pollen tube coming down. And then when we finally get around to it, you can have the different types of seeds and flowers, more seeds, etc. Biology coursework is 20% of the exam. Oh, wow. Somebody answered the entire worksheet already. I am so, oh, wow. I feel like, oh, yes, I've helped somebody do something. Did you find it difficult, those of you who did it, or it was something that you could do with the aid of the PowerPoints and with the aid of the videos? I'm glad I'm glad some of you found it easy to do. Biology, especially, sorry, especially for the paper 1 and paper 2, is really straightforward. And the more practice you get with past paper questions, and the more that you study effectively, the easier you will find it to be. So I'm really hoping that you take advantage of this opportunity and tell your friends who have not logged in yet that they should do so, because it would be really helpful for them. Oh man, I did not miss that question at all. Yes, you can go to the bathroom. The class is almost finished. Okay, we've been on here too long. We are now starting to talk foolishness. Paper 1 has 50 multiple choice questions. Paper 2 has 8 individual questions, each of which are worth mostly 10 marks, but sometimes as few as maybe between 9 and 11, depending, but the total number of marks would be 80 for paper 2. Paper 3, which is the extended, that's for the people who are going to try to get themselves those delicious A's and B's. They have 2 sections. Section A, which has structured questions, which are similar to the structured questions in paper 2, but with a greater degree of difficulty, requiring you to apply knowledge, just higher level thinking skills. And the section B are what they call the free response questions. Some people call them essay questions. I prefer free response because they are also sectioned and you want to answer them by section. So since we seem to be repeating ourselves with our questions, I wish you good luck, and I will see you later this week when we will wrap up our reproduction in flowering plants. And next week we will come with a new topic, I hope. Thank you all for being here. I'm glad we were able to be of use to you. And the other PowerPoint and the video will be uploaded for you. If I find any other nice ones, I'll upload them too. Thanks again.